Thank you for joining us today. My name is Charley Beresford. I'm Executive Director of Columbia Institute and one of the authors of today's report. I'm going to be moderating our webinar today on the report, Back in House, Why Local Governments Are Bringing Services Home. We launched this report last fall, and it directly tackles the idea that contracted out services cost less. In fact, a full 80% of the returning services in the Canadian case studies that we looked at in this report cited cost savings as the reason, one of the main reasons, for bringing those services back in-house. It's part of a Canadian and an international trend that to date has received very little coverage. Before I introduce today's speakers, I have a few housekeeping items. You should be able to both hear me and see the presentations during the webinar. We have about an hour for the presentation, and we will be sharing the recorded version plus the PowerPoints posted online so that you can access them later. A second very important point, if you need assistance, please dial 1-855-352-9002, press 1, then press 1 again, and then 1 once again. If you know certain eras of songs, this is like knocking 3 times on the ceiling if you need me. These 3 clicks will bring you to a recording with different troubleshooting options, and if you choose, a customer service agent who can help you connect. After we finish the presentation, we'll open the floor to questions and answers, and there are basically 2 ways that you can pose your question. You can type your question. There's a question box near the bottom of your control panel, or you can raise your hand. There is an icon to the left side of your screen. And that concludes the housekeeping items, so we're now ready for the main event. And our first speaker is another of our report authors, Keith Reynolds. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Charley, and thank you for joining us today. I'll start off by saying that this report arose from our observation over the last year or two as part of the Columbia Institute that some local governments in Canada were starting to bring back in-house work that had previously been contracted out or made into public-private partnerships. Now that was really a big change from what we had seen in previous decades. We really looked at it as a pendulum that was beginning to swing back in the other direction, and it was something that we wanted to look at. Now here in Canada and internationally since the 1970s, we've really seen a kind of economic orthodoxy at all levels of government that saw fiscal austerity, privatization, and liberalization become ends in themselves rather than a means toward a more equitable and sustainable growth for communities. That was an observation by Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winner in economics. Well, we looked around internationally and found that for local governments, for example, in the United Kingdom, in the 1980s, there really was no alternative to contracting out. Under the Thatcher government, Parliament basically forced local governments to contract out many of their services. Now they were of course followed by the Labour government, but under the Labour government there was basically no funding for local government projects unless they were handled as public-private partnerships. One of the reasons for that is that debt for public-private partnerships didn't show up on the books of governments. In 2009, arising from the economic crisis across the world, France adopted a large stimulus package for investments in public infrastructure. But that package included state guarantees for public-private partnerships. And of course, one of the things that public-private partnerships are supposed to do is take on risk. In Canada, we saw much the same trend. In 2008, there was a study that looked at Ontario and Alberta under the governments of Ralph Klein and Mike Harris. They found that those 2 provinces had significantly higher levels of privatization and contracting out at local governments than other provinces did. Here in BC, and this slide that's on your screen now shows this, in BC, our Premier told the Union of BC Municipalities in 2006 that there would be no money for local government capital projects from the provincial government unless the government's privatization agency, Partnerships BC, first considered whether or not it would be built as a public-private partnership. But the pendulum began to swing back in the other direction. In the UK, direct pressure to outsource was significantly reduced. And in 2011, a survey of more than 140 local governments by the British Association for Public Service Excellence published a report, and this is a quote from it. They found that 67% of those local governments surveyed had either brought a service back in-house, were in the process of insourcing, or were considering doing so. So there was a really dramatic change. Following the Labour government in Britain, we saw a new coalition government. Surprisingly, part of it was, and it was led by the Conservatives, who identified real problems with the public-private partnership process, and in fact set up a process that clawed back hundreds of millions of pounds of what were considered to be excess profits from privatized companies in the United Kingdom. In Germany and in France, large numbers of municipalities brought services back and are still bringing services back in-house, particularly in the areas of water and energy as well as transportation services. Perhaps one of the largest insourcing projects in the world was when the city of Paris brought their water services back in-house, both to save money and to provide better services for the people who live there. Here in Canada, doubts were also being raised, particularly for public-private partnerships. Right across Canada, auditors general were looking at public-private partnerships and beginning to question their benefits. On the screen you'll see Ontario's Auditor General raising significant questions, and it was also done in a number of places in Atlantic Canada. Quebec's Auditor General also raised the same questions, and so did the Auditor General in British Columbia. But something else happened in British Columbia which I think really surprised us here, and that was that the government's own Ministry of Finance conducted a review of Partnerships BC. And as a result of that review, they undermined some of the powers of Partnerships BC to intrude on local governments and to really force them to use privatization of their infrastructure. Perhaps one of the most important things that happened was that, arising from the last federal election, the new Liberal government announced an end to the mandatory P3 screen for funding by federal governments for local projects. This is an issue that we're probably going to be talking about more in the coming weeks as the federal government's budget comes down and may move back in the other direction. All of those things that happened internationally and what we were looking at here in Canada really made us want to have a look at what was happening with local governments here in Canada. And what we did with this report was to identify a number of communities. And if you look at your screen now, you'll see those communities across Canada that we looked at. Communities that were an example of local governments where work had been brought in-house, and to also look at the reasons why this was done and to try and place it in both a national and an international context. Now I want to emphasize that the 15 communities we looked at are not a comprehensive list of all the communities where work has been brought back in-house. Slide. Here in BC, we looked at Port Moody, we looked at New Westminster, we looked at Souk, and we looked at Port Hardy. But again, just looking at British Columbia, we could have just as easily chosen to examine a number of other communities. Cranbrook, for example, was one of the first communities in Canada that actually ended a public-private partnership because it wasn't serving their community. We could have looked at the District of Langley, which brought its one of its community centers back in-house, working with the union. We could have looked at White Rock with their decision to purchase back their water treatment facility. Or we could have looked at Victoria's decision to bring parking operations back in-house. So what we have are 15 examples across the country of communities that brought back different services and had different reasons for bringing those services back in-house. Interestingly, to a large degree, the reasons that these services were brought home in Canada mirrored the findings of major studies in particularly the United States and in Great Britain. The major reasons why they were brought back in-house, first of all, 80% of our 15 examples found they could save money by bringing the services back in-house. In Canada, a quarter of the communities said they had returned the work because of the inadequate quality of service. Again, in the United States, 50% of communities bringing work back home have said the same thing. 8 of our 15 communities had had problems with their contractor. And a third of our local communities who had brought work back home said they had done so because they had more capacity to do the work themselves. Finally, communities talked about a need for greater flexibility which they found they did not have when they were locked into a contract. Now, one thing worth noting is that in 11 of our 15 Canadian examples, Canadian municipalities said they had more than one reason to bring the work back in-house. Every local government will have gone through its own process in making a decision to bring their work back in-house. Looking at the 15 Canadian examples and other examples internationally, we've identified 10 best practices for local governments that are considering whether or not to bring their contracted work back in-house. Now, we were very fortunate as part of this project to have Gaetan as one of the leaders. He was able to share with us his own personal experience as Port Moody's city manager in bringing waste collection back in-house and the steps Port Moody went through. He'll talk more about that later, and he'll talk in detail about those 10 recommendations in our report. In closing, though, I want to highlight 2 practices that, to me, seem critically important, and that would be to engage the public and to make evidence-based decisions. Now, to do both of those things, you have to have real transparency in your decision-making process. Your public cannot engage with the process if they don't have the information. They can't engage with the process if the only thing that they have input into is what color they want to paint the contracted out facility. If there's one thing that we find to be missing in decisions often to privatize or use public-private partnerships, it's real openness and transparency about the facts. Now, for decades, contracting out public services seemed to be really a one-way street around the world and in Canada. It isn't anymore. Many local governments are finding out that they can deliver better services at better costs in a more transparent way and a more flexible way by bringing work back home. Thanks very much, and back to you, Charley.
Thank you very much, Keith. So Charley back at the mic here. Before we go on to hear about best practices for contracting in, we're going to pause for a moment to consider what we're calling governance checkpoints on the road home. A local government leader's role is about public welfare, not just the bottom line. And councillors are charged with making good governance decisions in very tight budgets, and that often means for quite a hot seat when we get to delivery of public services. And we get a decision-making point about delivery of public services in 2 instances. There could be a public outcry over safety, service quality, or expense that could lead to an early exit from contracted services. More likely, services are likely to come back in-house as the contract comes to a closure and if there is an opportunity to consider how the services have been delivered. So these governance checkpoints are points to keep in mind as you're traveling down that road home. We want to emphasize 7 areas. I'll briefly list them and then we'll talk about each in a short fashion. So the 7 areas, briefly, are quality of service. Is the public happy? How is the level of public engagement? Is there sufficient control over service delivery? Have we taken advantage of the staff pride advantage? Is there capacity in-house? And is the price compatible? So just a few additional points about each of those. The quality point. Has the quality of the contracted service met standards and expectations? Often insourcing is in response to poor service delivery. We need to ensure that internal technical evaluations are robust and explore quality from a quantitative and qualitative point of view. Has the public been happy with service delivery? You'll likely know this if that's not been the case. Has there been an opportunity for the public to share their opinion? As Keith mentioned, this is a very important process in good governance. Citizens have to have good information in order to be able to engage in the public decision, and you'll get more robust decisions with better levels of engagement of the public. Does the public have enough flexibility and control over local service delivery? This is both an operational and a governance question. Inflexibility in contracts can mean inefficient deploying of resources, and often there are new considerations that can arise that have not been anticipated when the contract was struck. For example, new environmental considerations. There's a really important question about the advantages of delivering the service in-house with staff who are committed to the municipality. We call this the in-house staff pride advantage, and it can lead to greater collaboration, great efficiency of services. Very seriously, when you're making a consideration as the contract and the contracts are being examined and you're looking for input, you need to consider whether you have capacity in-house to deliver the services. Now, Keith made a very interesting point about why services were coming back in-house in our survey. We found that a good portion of those, 30%, had a development of in-house capacity that enabled the services to come back in-house. If there's skepticism about this point, it's particularly important that an evaluation be accurate, and as Gaetan will emphasize in his next point, that apples are compared to apples. And finally, could the service be delivered in-house at a similar or better price point? And again, just to emphasize that 80% of the Canadian case studies from our report cite cost advantage for bringing services back in-house. So we're going to move on now and hear from Gaetan with some specific best practices pointers.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I'm really proud to be an associate with the Columbia Institute. What a great organization. My role this morning is to share with you a brief contracting in story, and then I'm going to go over a series of best practices as Keith introduced earlier. So first, this case study or story I'm going to tell, it started in the late 1990s when management at the time convinced the Port Moody Council to contract out its solid waste and recycling services. It would save money, management said. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Essentially what they did is to replace a contract with the union with a service contract awarded to a private company. The contractor's service deteriorated. People became angry. Later, they became furious. Complaints frequently escalated to mayor and council. And I had joined the city by then. We were making zero progress in terms of our recycling objectives, simply because we couldn't change our contract to adapt to new circumstances. Now, I knew how the decision to contract out had been made. At the time, management investigated contracting out. They wrote a report to council, and the union scrambled to prepare its own report. Union and management tried to poke holes in each other's report. And as new city manager, I was determined to avoid a repeat of the competing reports with council trying to play judge to select who was right. So we set up a joint task force. Now imagine equal representation of management and union on a task force, and we would share all information with each other. There was hesitation from some on council. Can't we just pick a better contractor? There was also hesitation among union members. Now this waste collection service is a mess. Why should our union members try to fix this mess? Despite all of that, there was trust built on the joint task force. It was not blind trust by any means. Questions arose such as, is the data obtained by the city manager from another city comparing apples to oranges? Or is the data provided by the national union biased in any way? But in the end, we agreed, and the union and management made joint recommendations. Council decided to bring the waste collection in-house. Now let me go over in a more practical way over these best practices that we collected from the experience across Canada. First one is to adopt an in-house service policy. All cities have procurement policies that set out how to seek competitive bids and proposals. These policies set out, for example, that up to a certain amount you get 3 quotes. Beyond that you publish tenders and so on. These purchasing policies should also say doing work in-house shall be one of the options. You're more likely to bring work in-house if you get reminded. It's too easy to just renew contracts year after year. I think we need to pause and look at the in-house option, and that should be set as a policy. Second one is to make evidence-based decisions. Make decisions that are based on solid business, good research, academic research, as well as research within the market, and make sure that those case analysis include all aspects of the work. Engagement of the public. Engaging the public is something Keith alluded to earlier, and it should go beyond the typical open house with a few boards trying to simply show the information and convince people of a decision. You should find an engaging way for people to provide input about their priorities, the kind of service that they want, and since many people assume that everything is cheaper if done by contract, I would urge you to use these public events to help kill the myth about contracting out. Now, you should be analytical as well, and that's our next best practice. How do you specify quality, service level? How do you write in a contract how you're going to deal with attitude by service providers? It's hard to deal with a good contractor who sends you a bad employee, but you have to do it. Is it really cheaper by contract? How do you write a contract so that you can actually improve the service in the future, expand the service area, for example, if circumstances change? What if there are serious contract violations? Look at termination clauses. Are they a real deterrent, or do they become a reward for the people who violate their contracts? The next best practice was also alluded to, and it is to involve the union in the business case analysis. Form a joint task force and engage the union in helping you answer all of these questions that are part of the analysis. Involve workers and their trade unions from the early stages of decision making. The next one is to set clear targets. Set service delivery targets that are quantified and specific. and make sure that you you develop ways to measure the performance over time. The next one is to compare, well, apples with oranges. And you can actually compare things that are operating on different premises, profit and non-profit. Be thorough when comparing business cases. Think of things like capitalization, amortization, present-day value, overhead for tendering and contract administration. Most importantly, contract supervision. And finally, life cycle costs. All these things are part of the comparison of options. And leading back to one of the things Charley mentioned, the pride advantage. Once you make the decision to deliver a service in-house, capitalize on that pride and help your employees succeed. Buy the equipment that a contractor would have bought at your expense. Roll out a really good communication plan, and this is crucial for a transition from contracting out to contracting in. Have a maintenance plan for the equipment that you purchase and address all deficiencies as they arise. Address them early. And finally, and I'm collating the last two best practices together here, is to measure results. And you're going to find that what you measure is in fact the extent of your success, which you can celebrate together. Share the credit for that success and involve council, management, and frontline workers in celebrating their common achievements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gaetan and Keith. And just a brief reminder, Gaetan, you were, that story was an early pioneer. Can you remind us, about a decade ago you led the way?
Well, that's right. About a decade ago. You're aging me here. And it certainly had a lot of upsides. We ended up with an immediate change in the diversion rate. We had been stagnating at about 40% diversion in our recycling, and it jumped to 60% almost overnight after we contracted in.
That's really impressive. We have now an opportunity, if you have a question that you want to ask of the team here. You can, again, a reminder, two ways that you can ask the question. You can type your question in the question area of the control panel, which is towards the bottom of your page, or if your computer has a microphone, you can raise your hand to ask a question. There's an icon to the left at the top part of your control panel. If you click on that button, we can see your raised hand next to your name, and we'll be happy to put you on live and to take your question. But I'm going to go to Keith here just for a moment, because there is a part of our findings that we haven't really had a chance to speak to, and I'm going to ask him to introduce it now. When we began this research, we referred to two reports that were pro-privatization that were produced about 15 years ago. I hope I've got my time frame there. I'm sure Keith will correct me. But we wanted to share with you what happened to those outsourcing examples. And again, remember, they were written from the point of view of outsourcing being the next best thing to sliced bread. Keith, perhaps you could enlighten us.
Thanks, Charley. These two reports were actually done 20 years ago.
20 years ago, there you are.
In 1997. And that was really at a time when probably pressure on local governments in Canada to contract out or privatize their work was higher than it had been at just about any other time. It had been part of that process that began in the 1970s and just continued to grow through that. In 1997, there were two reports that were done by the Intergovernmental Committee on Urban and Regional Research, which, as Charley has said, really acted as a cheerleading team for contracting out work, and identified a number of communities where the work had been contracted out. Well, as things stand, we went back and looked at those communities and found that yes, a majority of them for a variety of reasons, still had either contracted out work or at least partially. But 40% of those communities had brought work back in-house. And it was done for a number of reasons. I thought the community of Airdrie, Alberta was particularly interesting. They had previously contracted out their assessment work. But as the community...
This is property assessment work.
Property assessment. But as the community grew over the years from 15,000 to 60,000, they really found that, first of all, they had the capacity to do the work. And more important, they found that it gave them much more control over how assessment issues were handled than they were able to have in another process. But I think in terms of that whole question of the capacity in the community, I think one of the questions that raises is maybe people should be talking to themselves about how we get more capacity. Do we? If they look at a situation in their community and say, we don't have the capacity to do this in-house, maybe one of the questions they should be asking is, why don't we have that capacity and how can we get it? A number of the communities, again, contracted the work back in because they found they could do it more cheaply. And I have to identify Paradise, Newfoundland as one of those communities.
And so there is a Paradise we can find.
There is a Paradise, Newfoundland. And the mayor said that when they contracted garbage collection back in-house, quote, they could cut the cost of garbage collection by half by doing it themselves. So even in those examples that 20 years ago were being given as real reasons why everything should be contracted out, almost half of them have now brought the work back in-house for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a pretty high return rate. I want to talk a little bit more about the capacity question. Now, Gaetan, in your presentation, you talked about the contracting out of services in the first place in Port Moody. Was that related to a capacity question or a perceived capacity question? Can you tell us the history of the contracting out?
Well, certainly that's a really good question. The contracting out resulted from certainly information I got from the people involved as a result of a review of work injuries and a few other things that it seemed like the easy solution to farm out the problem, to outsource the problem that were being experienced. Now, there were other solutions, buying better equipment, hiring more people. There were other solutions that would have been worth exploring at the time, and they were explored briefly in that competing union report I'm talking about in the example that's documented. But really, I can give a very practical example of a capacity issue. In Port Moody, we were contracting out electrical services, and for very good reasons for a number of years. The total amount of contracting that we were doing was roughly $150,000 a year. And at that price, you could not hire an electrician on staff and have a bucket truck and those kinds of things in place. It would have been more expensive. And every year, we did a quick exercise with the finance officer to look at, whether or not we had passed that threshold where it would be worthwhile, where there would be economies of scale to doing the work in-house. And 1 year after we constructed in the preceding couple of years a new police department building, a new recreation center, 1 year we looked at the numbers and that threshold had been achieved. We could hire 2 people. You need an electrician and a second person for safety reason. We could hire 2 people and have a bucket truck, and all of that was going to be cheaper than going by contract. So it's not all about ideology. It's not all about a conspiracy for the private sector to capture as many of the public sector jobs as possible. It's just a practical issue of looking at the numbers and do the math and decide, well, you know, last year it was actually better for our taxpayers to contract out the service, but this year the conditions have changed, and now it's going to be better for our taxpayers to do it in-house. And I urge people to simply do the math and set ideology aside.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to continue on the capacity question before I address the question that's arrived in our inbox. Keith, there was a story of in the services that came back in-house, one of our 15 case studies that we've examined in Port Hardy. In that case, there was a service delivery that was contracted out. The employee that was involved with it might have been employees that were involved in delivering the city services went to work with the contractor, and then the contract came up and was under reconsideration. Perhaps you could pick up the rest of that story, because it's a very interesting capacity question.
Well, that's exactly what we had reported to us that happened there, that when they were looking at some fairly serious improvement that needed to be dealt with their water supply, the feeling was that they simply did not have the capacity to do that work themselves. And as you said, Charlie, in fact, the people who were actually working for them went to work for the contractor.
They did, and then they gained additional knowledge while they were working with the contractor, and the city was well placed when it looked at bringing services back in-house.
Well, as time went on, they found not only did they feel that they could bring the work back in-house, that they now had the capacity to do the work, but as it was in the words of the council at the time, it was in the best interests of the taxpayer.
Now, can I just challenge you a little bit, both of you, on that word taxpayer? May I submit to you that we might also be talking about residents in your communities, and that not all residents necessarily are property taxpayers?
Well, in fact, I think there's a good argument to be made that often, instead of talking about taxpayers, we should be talking about citizens, because you know the relationship between the people who live in the community and their government is not just a commercial relationship. It's a relationship of the rights of citizens, and that's something I think we need to keep in mind.
And I think both of you have that at the heart of your comments. I am going to turn to our question now, and here it is. This is from a councillor in a Lower Mainland community who met with QP Local yesterday at their request, as they are in the middle of bargaining. At the end of the discussion, the councillor asked them if they could think of other services in the city that could benefit from moving in-house. So far, the community in question has garbage, grass cutting and cleaning, civic buildings only, in-house. The QP people paused and couldn't really think of anything. How can councils and unions work together to review, survey, identify new possibilities, and not become complacent? Do you have any examples of such a process of ongoing overview, I suppose, of the health of service delivery? Either of you.
Well, certainly, and I think that's all part of this best practice of making sure that your procurement policy incorporates an analysis of the work done in-house. On an annual basis, with the folks working in our finance department, we did an analysis, and we had a certain number of criteria. We didn't look at the capital projects. I don't think that governments generally, unless they're very large institutions, can equip themselves to build their own buildings. So capital projects tend to be best handled by contract. But there are cases, there are exceptions to that. You can do some capital works in-house, such as, for example, trail improvements and those kinds of things. But capital projects being excluded, then we looked at all the different service contracts that we had and assessed them on the basis of is the work done by contract cheaper, and does it provide as good a service as if it was done in-house? Would there be a benefit to analyze those services and bring them in-house? So we brought in-house electrical services, which I talked about, garbage and recycling collection. We also brought in-house housekeeping services. And one year, it was worthwhile to bring the recreation center and all the different amenities in-house, but it was not quite as cost-effective for City Hall until we grew and evolved into different services, and then we passed the threshold where it was worthwhile to bring it in-house. And I think this kind of analysis is absolutely part and parcel of good management.
It's Keith here, and what I wanted to say was that many years ago I was involved in a survey, and what I discovered was that, at least in terms of local unions, they simply weren't aware of what the services were that were contracted out. And in fact, I think many councillors aren't really aware of it all either. And in fact, to a large degree, I think even if you went to management of many communities and say, what work do we contract it out, they'd be hard-pressed to provide a list. So I think a starting point for what we're talking about is to simply establish a list of the services that are contracted out. Unfortunately, I can't speak very well for municipalities outside British Columbia, but here in British Columbia we have a form municipalities are required to fill out for the provincial government called a Statement of Financial Information. And in that Statement of Financial Information, they have to list every single company that they pay more than $75,000 a year to. That's a good starting point, just to look at that list and say, what is who are we paying money to, and what are the services that are providing? And I think, for example, this is maybe even going beyond our discussion, but many communities pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to outside law firms. And a number of communities have asked themselves, at what point does it make more sense to hire an in-house lawyer to do much of this work? And I think if they were to look at these contracts, if they were to create a full list, that's a question that might get asked more often.
So 3 very interesting pieces of advice here. Create a list so that you have an awareness of what the services are. I think the corollary might be sharing the list in a wide fashion. Combined with a regular annualized review, and also combined with a clause in your contracts that calls for a comparator as they expire. So 3 very, very concrete suggestions. I hope that that's helpful for the councillor from the Lower Mainland community.
Charlie, can I add a fourth?
Yes.
And it's very simple. Go to your staff and say, do you think we could do this cheaper? Do you think we could do this better at the same price? And you're going to be surprised with the answer. They're going to come up with good ideas. We've got to trust and engage our frontline workers in helping us manage better.
Trust and engage our frontline workers in helping us manage better. That's a really good takeaway for that one. I want to highlight another best practice, another piece that might be helpful, and that is introduced by both of you in your presentations as the idea of measurement, of building into your contracts and, for that matter, your programs, the idea of measurement. How do you tell how things are working? Anything further you'd like to add to that?
I'd like to look at the United States. It's Keith Reynolds speaking again. They have done there's some organizations there that have done some really excellent work, doing really in-depth analysis of work that's being contracted out and work that's coming back home. Interestingly, they're finding that in the United States, which I think many people consider to be, the home of privatized work, that in fact work is coming back into local governments at the same rate that it's being contracted out. But one of the things they found in their study is that the majority of local governments in the United States that contracted out work had no mechanism to monitor the work. The work was simply contracted out. It was out of their hands, and they didn't look at it anymore until they were forced to. And I think Gaetan gave a really good example of how a community can be forced to look at whether or not they contract out work. The other thing about this practice is it's a hidden cost. Even if you have real mechanisms in place to monitor the contracted out work, there's a cost to it, which is often not included in the cost of what it takes to privatize the work.
So it'd be part of the apples to apples, oranges to oranges comparator comment. Did you have anything more on the monitoring, Gaetan?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of sources about managing results and measuring results, and a lot of them have to do with performance targets and so on. So that's easy to find. One thing I picked up, my spouse is somebody who has been for the longest time going into failing practices and turning them around and making them profitable. And what she's been talking about is the measurement of attitudes, service attitudes. And this has to do with the way people talk to clients at the counter, clients or building permit applicants. It's the same thing. The way they provide the service, the way that they engage with the public. And when I talked about the kind of latitude that we gave to frontline workers when we did the garbage collection in-house, one of the things that we were dealing with is public awareness and education. And we told our frontline staff, our drivers, that if they ran into overtime because they stopped and educated some of the people at the curb, that was perfectly okay. Leaving notes on the recycling bins that something had not been done in accordance with the regulation, as opposed to leaving the bin at the curb, which some municipalities do, and people have to, they realize that because they didn't follow the rules, they have to bring this smelly garbage bin in the garage for another week.
I think that's called natural consequences.
Those kinds of, the attitude of staff, the way that you deliver service, and you measure that by collecting information that's not in financial tables, that's surveys, that's talking to the public, that's monitoring the exchange on Facebook about the service delivery and making sure that you address those problems. That's all part of measuring results.
Well, thank you. We have a follow-up comment. Excellent, thank you, regarding the possibility of an in-house lawyer. I've asked this of management staff in the past because we spend approximately $200,000 a year on this. City management said it would be impossible to get the legal expertise from one or two people working in-house that we get from an outside firm. I think that was the quick answer from management. I'm not certain that was correct. What could I say in response to that?
Well, I think, again, we've talked about capacity before. And we've talked about, why don't we have the capacity? And perhaps one of the questions that should be asked is, why is it that we can't build this capacity in-house? First of all, why couldn't we look for a lawyer that has municipal experience? And secondly, what could we do to make sure that we got that lawyer, that lawyer built their capacity and became a real strong force in our community for delivering the needs of the community?
Okay, well, thank you. We are getting to the point of closure here. And just a couple of reminders. We're going to be uploading onto the website a recorded version of our presentation today along with the PowerPoints. I want to thank you very, very much for joining us today. If you'd like to download a copy of the report, if you haven't yet, please go to www.civicgovernance.ca and you'll be able to find the report on the website. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to share them with us. You can send them here to Sharon Rowling at Columbia Institute. Her email is srowling, S-R-O-L-I-N-G, at columbiainstitute.ca. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to more stories about public services coming back in-house.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the people who've joined us.